Freedom's greetings, Helldivers. Ervin here, and today we're taking a look at my tier list for the support weapon class in Helldivers 2. I honestly never thought I would make a tier list in this game outside of the for fun ones that we do on the weekly Helldivers Experience podcast. But after the Buffdivers patch, it's become a lot more relevant a talking point. While before the different support weapons had many different strengths and weaknesses, all being the best at their own particular jobs, after the patch, our support weapons have never been closer or more comparable. All the AP4 weapons have seen massive usability improvements against heavy units, alongside the anti tank class receiving massive improvements for performing their role. It's now not a stretch to say, even on difficulty 10, most of your support weapons are going to be performing in some respect against both factions. But which ones are the best? Which weapons are sitting at the top of the pile, and which ones are still struggling on despite receiving buffs just like the rest? We're going to be going through each weapon individually and ranking them accordingly based on how well they perform against both the automatons and the terminids, both having their own unique lists. This is going to be a long video, but before we get started, I want to thank today's sponsor. Instant Gaming is my personal favorite place to get any new releases at a heavily discounted rate compared to competitors. It's not just any marketplace, though. Unlike many of its peers, Instant Gaming gets their keys straight from authorized sellers, sporting a fantastic 4.7 Trustpilot score and near instant customer service support should you be dissatisfied. So, if you're looking to pick up the hottest new releases like the Forever Winter, one of my personal favorites, you can get it here for 36% off. Or maybe you're thinking about pre ordering Monster Hunter Wilds? Why not pick it up here and save a few bucks? Use my link in the description below and start saving with Instant Gaming today. Let's start off strong, and by strong, I mean a strong stench. Something absolutely vile, the Airburst Launcher. This weapon is irredeemably terrible when it comes to both fronts of the war. Do you want an Airburst strike? The majority of you would likely say no. There are typically better stratagems out there that fulfill its purpose, despite it having 3 volleys such as Gatling Barrage. So what if you could have a support weapon that did the same, but only one blast? Well, you would still probably say no, because this thing, despite spraying a massive amount of shrapnel, totaling in at 4100 ballistic and 6400 explosive damage all at AP3, the randomness of where that shrapnel goes after launching will see even tightly packed groups of enemies often survive the blast and make it next to worthless for dealing with tanks all in the same swoop. It costs you your backpack, and it has the most obnoxious 6.7-second non-team reload in the game. Although you get 6 rockets worth, it's going to be difficult to justify taking the support weapon compared to just about any other option in the game. That all being said, however, it is the best PvP support weapon in the game. If your intent is to accidentally kill and troll your friends, then this thing is S plus tier. You can use it to absolutely demolish your teammates, then reinforce them at a Bile Titan so they can kill it with their now 2500 damage Hell Pods. As long as you have reinforces and you don't get kicked out of the match, when you think about it, this will keep taking out heavies as needed. But in reality, it's going in the troll tier on both factions. No discussion. Now let's talk about something good, not just good, one of the best to establish our two extremes. The Recoilless rifle. This weapon, with its 3200 ballistic, AP6 damage, and 150 explosive chaser, does fantastic work against both factions. While this is an AT launcher, meaning its fire rate and limited ammo supply of only 7 rockets total before resupply means it's not ideal for taking out medium targets. That's what good primaries are for in the end, regardless, though. Dispatching chaff and medium enemies. This is the factor that is going to define our tier list the most. While there are primary weapons that can be a bit more flexible in their role by being effective against some tank flanks, charger butts, or bile titan bellies, it's never going to be an ideal choice when there are support weapons like the recoilless rifle taking out bile titans and factory striders in singular headshots. Machine guns and AP4 weapons now sit in the middle of the road, having workable breakpoints for tanks while still being a luxury against medium targets. However, their performance compared to your primary's performance when it comes to medium targets is going to be far more comparable than a primary like the Eruptor trying to compare to the value of a recoilless launcher when it comes to dispatching chargers. Overall, this simple fact means generally anti tank weaponry is going to be ranking higher than most versatile support weapons, or generally a rank higher, especially when considering this is all based off the highest difficulty in the game, where tank class enemies are extremely common. And with the Recoilless rifle dispatching every single heavy unit in the game from at least one angle or one limb, along with fabricators from any direction, it's easy to see why the Recoilless easily takes a top shelf spot in the S tier for both factions.
Reloading you!
Yeah, yeah! Mess them up! My turn. They're all dead. Next, let's talk about the Ark Thrower, a support weapon that trades away DPS and burst damage for not a lot anymore. The Arc Thrower against the Terminids especially feels like a bad blitzer. While the Arc Thrower can damage heavy units and does kill them eventually, where the blitzer has no hope of ever doing so at all, it is significantly worse at clearing hordes despite it having 20 more meters of effective range due to how low the fire rate is, and it forcing you to walk very slowly in between shots where the blitzer is capable of kiting in between rounds. You get punished and overwhelmed very quickly due to how low the fire rate is, despite its ability to now stun anything smaller than a Titan. Meaning we have a weapon that can't crowd control a horde of any notable size without getting you killed or forcing you to constantly attempt to create distance that you realistically can't because the bugs are only slightly slower than you in ultralight armor, just so we can get some worse battlefield control than a primary offers us in exchange for some abysmal heavy killing capability. While making a charger stand still until it dies is funny, it's also pointless compared to just killing them instantly with a bomb or a rocket. The Arc Thrower unfortunately ends up in my troll pick tier for both factions, as against automatons, the lengthy charging intervals get you cut to pieces by rockets and lasers that now deal 30% more damage than last patch. You can maybe stand your ground and have some decent usage out of this weapon if you're in heavier armor against the bots, escalating its performance to D tier. As it's still not a gunship answer despite its range increase, you are overall going to struggle more than if you brought anything higher on this list. Moving on to the HMG, this weapon has fallen from grace with the Buffdivers 2 update. Although losing 15 durable damage going from 50 to just 35 may not seem like a lot, this weapon has bad handling, long immobile reloads, and very little in the way of ammo. Couple this with the fact that the only ideal targets left for it that isn't highly durable is just the Devastators. An enemy most good primary weapons handle very well already, and it's easy to see why this weapon has fallen down into just C tier for both factions. It's held up from falling any further by in fact having extremely high raw DPS potential, making it a workable option for most if not all threats in the game, while flexing as a medium enemy answer. But it's always going to be giving you modestly subpar results, landing at a spot in C tier for bots and D tier in the bugs due to the ammo economy being non existent and stationary reload really hurting you against this faction. This nerf was both something I originally didn't expect to hurt this bad and didn't expect to be on purpose. I was super surprised to see Arrowhead double down on this change, saying it was intended. The nail in the coffin is it now suffers an armor penetration loss down to just 3 when firing at a semi extreme angle. Personally, I would fully revert both of these changes, as even then, it wouldn't climb above A tier for either faction in my mind. Next, let's rank a fan favorite, the Railgun. I've made a lot of content over this last half a year on the Railgun, and it's likely my most played support weapon. With its rework during the Buffdivers patch, seeing it escalated to a maximum of 1500 damage and 563 durable damage when fully charged. But its armor penetration was capped at level 5 and no longer scales. This has made it overall a far better weapon than it was last patch, though. This massive damage increase was overall balanced out by the enemies getting far higher health pools, but this does allow the railgun, while not taking your backpack, a very important feature when it comes to the Terminids, in my opinion, where the personal shield generators are very powerful, can game it out against every medium and heavy target in the game within a reasonable amount of rounds. Most notably able to one-shot hulks to the head, gunships to the thrusters, and comfortably dispatching Bile Titans in 2 to 3 shots depending on the charge level. It's not the most convenient charger killer, with it having to reach a high charge level against the rear to dispatch them, or otherwise several shots at high charge into the leg or head, and tanks with their cannon turrets and counterparts soaking a lot of rounds at high charge as well, while forcing odd angles as it cannot penetrate the front. That last bit was unintended according to Arrowhead, but working with what I've been given in the current state of things, I'll be playing it safe and putting the Railgun in A tier for both factions. It has some amazing one shot kill matchups that definitely allow it to specialize into a team, but a team of 4 Railguns would definitely suffer due to its lacking capabilities against some of the game's heaviest targets. Let's get this one out of the way. The Stalwart, a support weapon underperforming so hard that our podcast primary tier list, which ranked it as a primary weapon for fun, still only gave it an A tier when stacking up against primary weapon options. The abysmal damage takes a minimum of 3 bullets to drop a hunter outside of a headshot, which, to be fair, doesn't take long with its insanely high modular fire rate. But as the only light armor penetrating support weapon in the game, while the flamer class of primary and even secondary is running around with AP4, definitely damages my appetite for this weapon. It has a ton of bullets, but the problem is those bullets just don't do much on either side of the conflict. Bringing this weapon is going to be unfortunately our second troll pick tier for the bots and only D tier for the bugs due to it pairing well in blitz missions with primaries like the eruptor and crossbow. The best thing they could do for this weapon in my opinion is shift it to being a primary weapon and modify from there. This weapon currently represents what you would hope the majority of our Liberator editions 1 through 7 could accomplish, and not what you want from our support weapon slot, let alone costing you a stratagem to bring this thing in. We might as well finish off the MG rankings with the MG43, which meets in the middle for the Stalwart and HMG options. This weapon is the first support weapon you're granted when you begin the game and will likely be used for a while when you're first starting out. While it does have some decent merits in lower difficulties thanks to its medium penetration when you are lacking such options in your primary weapon arsenal, it really doesn't stick around for long for most Helldivers. With 90 damage, it does at least kill hunters in 2 rounds, which makes it relatively efficient against Terminid chaff, and the damage is high enough to take out Devastators in 2 headshots or very quickly through the stomach region. This is more or less where its merits end, however, being one of only 2 support weapons in the game now that don't deal with heavies well at all, simply lacking the penetration level to do so. With an overall middling ammo supply, abysmal durable damage, mirroring the HMG at only 35, although it does have better fire rate, you can quickly trade this support weapon out for another one found above it as soon as you have a wider arrangement of primaries at your disposal, landing it in the D tier for the bugs, where its only merit is its chaff killing capabilities, rivaling some high tier primary options, and D tier in the bots, where its only merit is against taking out Devastators with the relative efficiency of a high tier primary option. Let's talk about the EATs next. Expendable anti tank launchers, in my opinion, got the short end of the stick when it comes to the anti tank launchers with the Buffdivers patch. This stratagem is the peak of inconvenience, forcing you to call in a new pair every time you are faced with a problem that requires a rocket launcher. Then requires you to get to where it was dropped, retrieve it, ready it, which takes just enough time to be inconvenient, then finally fire, and you better hit. Because you only have 2, and now you need to pick up the next one and ready that thing before it can be fired, all while not being pushed from your position. That all sounds pretty bad, and I don't think it can be argued that the EAT is the peak of inconvenience when it comes to these launchers. But during a rocket defense mission where you can stack them infinitely as needed in a fortified position where you don't need to worry about calling them in as they're needed, but just as they come off cooldown, they are a far, far better pick. Against bugs, the EAT shares every breakpoint with the Recoilless launcher, dropping all heavy units except the Impaler despite it not having enough health to do so, in just one rocket, landing it a spot in A tier. As nothing that can one-shot kill a Biotitan, regardless of how fiddly it is to use, can really be justified any lower than that. For the bots, although it still maintains the same ability to dispatch fabricators in one blast, it lacks the one-shot breakpoints on tanks, turrets, and factory striders the Recoilless possesses, making it a numerically worse pick while being far less convenient to utilize. At the end of the day, it's still doing a good job at what it does against this faction, landing it in B tier, which is a good option. Not great, not bad,
Not great, not terrible.
but a choice nonetheless. However, if you're utilizing this stratagem in a rocket defense, it'll escalate both these rankings by one tier due to a lot of the usability issues being hand waved by the circumstances, and every team benefiting from an EAT hoarder during this op. Since we're on the topic of anti-tank launchers, I might as well take the spear and get that out of the way next. The spear also received the short end of the stick. The Commando launcher's original introduction saw it lose its unique omnidirectional fabricator clearing capability, but now every launcher besides the Commando is able to do the exact same thing, while the spear still has to contend with a lock-on that breaks anytime a chest-high wall intervenes. While it does share all the one-shot breakpoints the Recoilless rifle has, the lock-on often gets in the way of utilizing it, as it can be challenging in a way not necessary to the Recoilless to actually land face shots on Factory Striders or Titans. Throw in the fact it's just less ammo at only 4 missiles, and the spear has fallen its way down to just B tier on the bugs, where its finicky headshot requirement on the Bio Titan, lacking ammo supply, and overall worse reload speed than the Recoilless, making it oftentimes a liability in comparison. But as it still maintains one-shot kills on the Chargers, it can sit in the B tier overall. The bots, it manages to stay in A tier thanks to it being the only launcher that can currently one-shot a tank or turret from any angle, maintaining one unique quality between them, despite its finicky headshots on Factory Striders and lock-on requirements for Hulks. At the end of the day, it's still one-shotting the majority of the heavies and taking out Fabricators, so that's an A tier weapon in my mind. The grenade launcher is up, and this thing just isn't very good anymore. It was never amazing, mind you, but being one of the only 3 support weapons with less than level 4 armor penetration when every heavy's main body besides the Factory Strider has been moved down to class 4 is just not great news when it only got 1 magazine for compensation. The crossbow getting buffed to dealing almost the same explosive damage but with over 10 times its impact damage is also doing it no favors, as it has less ammo than the primary weapon and is arguably on about the same exact level of effectiveness besides the superior fire rate. It's virtually worthless against every heavy in game, not having the damage output or penetration to keep up with its peers, and even with 3 spare magazines, it still needs to be run with a supply pack to have any fun at all before it's all over. Against the Terminids, it's going in D tier due to its lack of capability to do anything better than a higher tier primary. In lower difficulties on spewer maps, it'll be a lifesaver when you're still leveling up and unlocking new guns, but in difficulty 10, it's fallen off almost completely. Against bots, it's going to be in the troll pick category due to it having just about no merits whatsoever over a crossbow or a ruptor, while having zero anti-air capability due to being a launcher. A bump to penetration 4 and maybe a reduction to the minimum arming distance would likely do a lot for this weapon. The flamethrower has had a very turbulent 2 months, but has landed back in a spot where it's better than ever before. When the Quezar Cannon was nerfed and the Charger Behemoths were introduced to run rampant in a landscape where anti-tank weapons were suddenly underperforming, it was at this time where the flamethrower began to see a very high volume of use for its charger roasting capabilities before being nerfed into the ground by a miscellaneous change, only to be rebuffed and revamped into the Buffdivers patch, now finding itself right back into its role. It once again has very solid time to kill ratios for every charger variant in the game, as well as the Impalers, and can now even flash fry the Bile Titans relatively quickly. On top of all of this anti-tank capability, the flamethrower is very functional as an area denial tool and horde clear thanks to its burning status effect. Now, the Flamer isn't without its cons for all this power, of course. It has very limited range at only 21 meters, and only crowd control it imparts is through death, as it has no staggering capability or stun despite how dangerously close you have to play to maximize its damage. Thanks to it lacking a backpack, however, this means we can pair it up with the personal shield to help protect ourselves at these dangerously close distances from the bugs. Considering this weapon is very effective against every single Terminid despite its range constraints, I'm inclined to call this one S tier for the bugs. When it comes to the automatons, the story couldn't be more different, though. The range really starts to be a serious problem when you're no longer dealing with a majority melee force, but enemies with rockets and lasers that outrange you by hundreds of meters. While you can now challenge Hulks to a cookout, and this is hilarious, it's not like they are staggered or stunned during this interaction, and their 20 other buddies nearby are still shooting you. Couple this with the fact you now take on average 30% more damage this patch than last patch from lasers when being shot anywhere other than your head, which still takes a ton of damage anyway. And the flamer for bots is going into D tier. It still has all the raw firepower it did on the Terminid front, but the range of engagement and how fast our Helldivers fall from the laser damage increase will knock out your pilot light before you ever really get rolling. The AMR, the premier high powered sniper rifle everyone loves in every shooter known to man, with the scope alignment fixed, and every diver who got used to how jank it was last patch in tiers as a result, the AMR has become much more functional for mainstream use. The additional durable damage also notably improved the breakpoints on several enemies, such as how it now matches the 2-shot kill breakpoint against gunships the autocannon has enjoyed since the dawn of time, and can now take out alpha commanders in a singular headshot the way they could with normal commanders. Taking into account it can now damage any heavy unit in the game, it's certainly seen some vast improvement over last patch. However, similar to the Railgun, the AMR has now very good matchups and very bad ones. It sees extremely good use against Devastators, Alpha Commanders, Bile Spewers, Hulks, Rocket Striders, and Gunships, but does not perform particularly well against Titans, Chargers, Factory Striders, or tanks. It's definitely a mark better than it was in the previous patch, and much more enjoyable for a casual user thanks to the scope actually being aligned, which is going to lead me to be placing it in A tier for bots and B tier for bugs, as the majority of its good matchups are in bots, and the range of engagement definitely favors it there. It's a very powerful medium killer, but if you bring the AMR along, you are definitely going to want to compensate with some heavy clearing stratagems or teammates running better anti tank options. Alright, let's get the sterilizer out of the way. The gas warbond, in my opinion, is likely the worst warbond in the game thus far, as the gas rework has seen the status's damage brought down to near non existence, attaching the least reliable crowd control method in its place. The sterilizer has the worst damage in the game, and only has a very inconsistent, low duration, confusing effect to show for it. With an effective range of only 20 meters, it's currently an easy D tier for me against the bugs, as its low range, low damage, and inconsistent effect has it outclassed by just killing the enemies more often than not with any halfway decent primary weapon, and a troll pick tier against the bots for a variety of reasons that should be obvious. This weapon desperately needs clouds of gas to linger in the area it fires, so it can become a real crowd control capable of area denial weapon. Something the flamethrowers are currently doing through simply making any chaff dead that walks through the firewalls. So the least this weapon can do is have area denial through crowd control. This thing needs help. Let's palate cleanse with a quick conversation about the autocannon next. The autocannon before the Buffdivers patch was the undisputed king of Helldivers 2, despite never seeing a single direct change. It's the all-rounder, capable of dealing with any enemy in the game at least decently, whether they be small, medium, or large, and is never the wrong pick for the job. Other weapons might specialize and swing above its class against certain enemies, like the anti-tank weapons, which definitely outclass it for heavy clearing now, but the autocannon still does solid damage against these targets in its own right, especially on the automaton front, where I'm giving it a well deserved S tier rating. For bugs, the cost of a backpack slot, in my opinion, is actually quite a bit higher, as shield packs are extremely useful against this faction, and the breakpoints to take down heavies, while they do now exist, are not the best, leading me to sling it into A tier. The fact the Buffdivers patch has me actually placing this weapon among peers at all is proof we've moved in the right direction. Now let's move on to the Commando rocket launcher, a weapon that walked so the Recoiless rifle could run. I pronounced this weapon dead the moment the Buffdivers patch released during my full breakdown of the anti-tank weapon class, and that has held up through the month, although at the end of the day, it's still an anti-tank launcher. Generally, it's performing just under EATs as it does only slightly above half the damage they deal, only seeing a few specific improvements in its breakpoints when firing at a 2-to-1 ratio with EATs or the Quezar Cannon. It's not weak by any means, but the higher cooldown for nearly the same overall damage two AATs can put out is pretty difficult to justify now. When they dealt generally 75% of its damage, it was a much better trade off, as the Commando with one rocket could often match what the EATs were capable of in one shot. Now, this isn't really the case, bringing the Commando launcher down from what would have been S tier last patch with its immaculate fabricator clearing capabilities down to a unremarkable B tier ranking for both factions. It's never a bad choice, but it's always going to be a worse choice than the Quasar, EATs, or Recoilless. Finishing off the anti-tank launchers, the Queso Beam Cannon, when it released, was among the best options in the game for trivializing the Terminid front thanks to that wonderful 10-second cooldown that was just as quickly ripped away from it. After the anti-tank rework, though, the damage it puts out is now equal to the EATs, making it an overall much more convenient EAT, capable of putting out more shots per minute with no need to fiddle around with supply drops. While the EAT represents the peak of inconvenience, this infinite ammo anti tank launcher serves as the opposite. Given that it shares all its breakpoints with the AT, but notably does not suffer any fall off at range to its damage total, the Quezar Cannon is now the king of the Terminid front yet again, finding its way to the top of S tier there, where it can one shot any of the heavies besides the Impaler, which it really should be able to do. I don't know why it can't. It doesn't have enough health to survive. Arrowhead, what is going on here? And it still manages to sit at the top of A tier for the automatons. You can truly never go wrong with this weapon now, and it is a great pick in either faction. The laser cannon got a bit better for the Terminid front thanks to it now being able to at least deal some damage through enemy armored units, but with a lack of any kind of crowd control and the lowest support weapon raw DPS in the game, its uses end up being very niche. If you put the crisper stats next to the laser cannon without knowing anything about these two, you would expect the crisper to be the support weapon, not the secondary here. These are vastly different weapons, of course, as the Crisper lacks range and doesn't have laser pseudo infinite ammo, but I think my point is these two shouldn't be comparable by any measure. One of these is a support weapon, and the other is a sidearm. The health increase for the Factory Strider, Titan, Chargers, and tanks further hurts its usefulness this patch, as it didn't get any damage increase compensation like the anti-tank weapons or how the Railgun and AMR did. While its capabilities as a horde clearer have always been relatively comparable to a strong primary, so its head-popping medium enemy capability is widely a non-factor here as a result of that. It does still do notably great work against the automaton gunship, seeing itself as one of the premium anti-air weapons for the Western Front. This brings it to the B tier in the automatons and the D tier for the Terminids, as the Terminid faction is typically a case where you can lack damage or you can lack control, but you can't lack both, and the laser cannon certainly lacks both. That will about sum up my support tier list for the Buffdivers update. I've never been a big fan of tier lists, but with how much closer support weapons have become in their role over time, I feel it's now much more appropriate and useful than it's been in previous patches. If you enjoyed this style of content, be sure to like the video and comment below so I know to keep making them. And it's worth mentioning, if anyone spent a paragraph or two trying to argue their case for any of these weapons, I could realistically be convinced to bring them up a tier from their current position, as long as it wasn't the AMR, that is. So, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you would rank these weapons down below as well. Thanks for watching till the end, and have a wonderful day. I'll see you next time. Uh, 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 what have I done?
What happened?
I have an autocannon. Commando.